Well, good afternoon. Steve Cavalli here. It is April the 7th or the 8th, 2023. Now, some of you saw my first YouTube video back in July of 2020 when I shared my testimony, how I had come to Jesus. Um, Quite a funny story in places, very sober in others. But back when I did that video in 2020, I had mentioned to some of you that I had cancer, bone cancer. Um, yeah, it never really left me, and it's back with a vengeance. And I don't know how long I have, or how long I'll be functional. So my wife kind of put me up to this. She said that I should record my life story in a little more detail, um, primarily for the kids. So when I'm gone, my life story is here. But I thought I'd put it up for those of you that are interested. It's no better or no worse than any of your life stories, I'm sure. We've all got our life stories. Some say I'm a good storyteller. Well, perhaps I am. So I'm going to kind of do this in several videos, successive videos that I'll kind of do by chapters of my life. But let's start with my early life. So we'll call this chapter 1, okay? Just for the sake of continuity. So my grandmother and my grandfather on my father's side immigrated from Italy just before the earthquake in 1906. They met in San Francisco and married there. My grandfather was from the Swiss side of the border, my grandmother from the Italian side. They were both Italians. They just drew the line arbitrarily when they created the nations there. So shortly after they married, or around that time, the 1906 earthquake happened in San Francisco. There were many beautiful Victorian homes up on Nob Hill in San Francisco, one of them owned by Spreckels of the Spreckels Sugar fame. Some of you may or may not have heard of the Spreckels Sugar Empire, but he was quite wealthy, sugar producer. He owned 5 mansions in San Francisco at the time of the '06 earthquake. Well, all of Nob Hill was destroyed in the earthquake. It was just a flattened mess up there, but one house was standing, just one, and it was one of Spreckels' homes. The story I got is that my grandparents bought it for $600 and towed it on telephone poles with mules all the way down to Lombard Street in San Francisco, where they had purchased a lot on Lombard, right between Laguna and Webster Street on Lombard. So they put the house there on a foundation. It was all one house when Spreckels had it, 3-story, a beautiful Victorian. They turned it into 2 flats, the upper flat for my dad's older brother and his family, the middle flat for my mother and father, myself and my sister and my grandparents. All lived in the middle, and we all ate in the basement, communal style, big long table, at least 10 or 12 of us in the family. My dad and his 2 brothers and their wives, and always had a big long communal table. I remember as a child my grandparents rolling raviolis in the basement there. They had a big 3-foot wooden ravioli rolling pin, and they'd make homemade raviolis. And probably unknown even to my kids, or if they know, they may have forgotten, my dad had a twin brother named Eddie. And when they were born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around Eddie's neck, so he came out mentally retarded, my dad's identical twin. Now at that time, around a little after the turn of the century there was a state hospital up in Glen Ellen, California, and it was called the Home for the Feeble-Minded, quote unquote. And they brought Eddie up there and had him checked into the state hospital. They were unable to care for him. He was pretty profoundly retarded. Well, over the years they tried to visit him, but it was more than a couple hours drive in those days before Highway 1 was paved. and they had a 1916, or a 1926 Star automobile that they would go up and see Eddie. They finally decided it was too much, so they bought a small 3/4 acre parcel of land in Sonoma that had an old chicken house on it. And they converted that chicken house into kind of a little, I barely would call it a guest cottage. It was just a redwood chicken house. But they put a couple of walls in it to make bedrooms, interior walls, and had a wood burner cook stove in there to cook on and keep the place warm, and put a couple of brass beds in there and tried to live in it the best they could with stand-up kerosene heaters. And when they went to see Eddie, they could spend the night there instead of making that long drive. And they could even take him out of the hospital and bring him back to the little chicken house there, and have him for lunch and, maybe for dinner, and then take him back in the afternoon. So that's how we ended up with the property in Sonoma. Well, being Italians, they planted a vineyard on that 3/4 of an acre, and we started, growing grapes on that 3/4 parcel. And we had a big 500-gallon oak tank in the basement in San Francisco on Lombard Street. And we would bring the grapes from Sonoma down to Lombard Street, borrow someone's pickup truck, and bring the grapes to San Francisco and crush them and make our own wine, just for the family. I remember they had 3 50-gallon oak barrels where they would age the wine down in the basement. So I grew up in a communal Italian family. Enough said about that, okay? So I went to kindergarten in San Francisco, but shortly after I turned 5, my father decided to move up to Sonoma permanently. So that's how we ended up in Sonoma, California. He moved up there and he remodeled that chicken house, stuccoed the outside of it and sheetrocked the inside of it, and made it into a little house, 900 square foot, 2-bedroom, kitchen, small living room house. So we moved into that house when I was about 6, and then my father and his friends and his brothers built the main house on the property, a 3-bedroom house that remains to this day there. So from age 5, I grew up in Sonoma, age 5 or 6, and went to school in Sonoma. But because my grandparents were in San Francisco, I was down there every weekend until I was probably 16, 17. And I would take the bus, which stopped right in front of our Sonoma property. I'd get on the bus, go to San Francisco, spend the weekend with my grandparents and my dad's younger brother, who was very good to me. And that's where a lot of my adventures began before I knew Christ. I had a friend whose name was Richard Barraza, Hispanic kid. And we were up to no good all the time. I remember I was about 8 or 9. He was a little older, 10 or 11. And at the top of Lombard Street, and some of you who have been to San Francisco, as you come off the Golden Gate Bridge heading south, you're on Lombard Street. Well, it goes about 10 blocks and it tees at Van Ness. And there's a little uphill as it comes up to Van Ness Street. There's about 3 blocks of uphill coming up to Van Ness. Not a real steep grade, but pretty good grade. And on the corner of Van Ness and Lombard, there used to be a gas station. There's a high-rise there now, a big high-rise hotel. But in those days, there was a gas station. And on the front of the gas station, they had one of those great big 6-foot ribbed tractor tires. You've probably seen them with the ribs, like that. Big, giant tractor tire sitting on a stand with an insert that said tires $5.99. It was an advertisement. So we snuck out of our house about 2 o'clock in the morning. We agreed to meet, my friend Richard and I. I'm only like 8 years old, maybe 9, and he's 10, maybe 11. We went up there, and with a lot of work, we got that tire off of the stand, and we wanted to roll it down Lombard Street to see how far it would go. Well, in 1950, 55 or 56. There was no traffic on Lombard Street at 2 o'clock in the morning, not a car to be seen. So we got that thing set up on Van Ness and we gave it a push. It went down the first block and jumped. It went down the second block and jumped. It was going down the third block and some car was coming across the intersection. Bam! That thing hit the car, glass flying everywhere. We turned and ran as fast as we could go and hid ourselves in some bushes. I, to this day, don't know if we hurt anybody or killed anybody. I mean, thank God Jesus saved me. I was a mess. So that's one funny story from my growing up days in San Francisco. The other one, we were a little older now. We were about 10 to 13, I guess. He was a little older than me. I was a little older, 12. He was 14, I guess. And we had slingshots. And these were powerful slingshots that we had made from branches of trees. You know, a Y in a tree. Well, we had these powerful slingshots with inner tubes, strips of inner tubes that we had cut from old tires. And we would go down to the Presidio, the military base, where the soldiers would do target practice with their .45 calibers. And behind the barrier that they would shoot into, they had fire hoses, right? Tons of fire hoses that would stop the bullets. We would pick up pockets full of these .45 slugs. Now these things are an ounce of brass, maybe a little more. An ounce of brass, 45 slugs. We had pouches and we would carry these slugs with us and we would shoot pigeons and things with our slingshots. Well, my grandmother lived right in the middle of the block with a gas station on either corner. To the east and to the west, there was a gas station. Well, the western gas station was a King Regal, and it had a 30-foot sign with light bulbs all around, and they would light up concentrically. King Regal, King Regal, you know. So we would sit on my grandmother's upper deck, and we'd try to break the light bulbs. And we'd take our slingshots. You had to lob them pretty high to hit the sign. I mean, it was a half a block away. So you'd have to shoot them kind of up in the air and they'd come down and hit the sign. And if we were lucky, we'd break a light bulb or two. But we were so scared that we'd only shoot maybe 4 or 5 or 6 slugs. And then we'd go hide in the basement because we didn't want to get caught, you know, if they ever figured out where they were coming from. Well, we had done this a couple of times and had broken a light bulb or two. And we would always wait maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes for things to calm down. And then we'd walk over to the corner where the gas station was and see if we could find our slugs so we wouldn't have to go back to the Presidio to get more. Well, this one day, you know, we'd waited about 30 or 40 minutes after we shot the slugs and walked over there to get our slugs. And here's this ambulance with a woman on the stretcher with the gauze around her head and a big blood spot coming out of the gauze. And they're loading her in the ambulance. And I walked up to one of the paramedics and I said, "What happened to her?" And he holds up a .45 slug and he said, "Somebody shot her." She must have been walking on the other side of the street and this slug came down out of the sky and hit her in the head. I mean, thank God it wasn't a direct slingshot hit. It just came down, you know, with the arch that we had shot it. But it knocked her out, I guess. Knocked her out cold. We turned and ran because my parents had told me about the electric chair, you know, that if anybody kill somebody that you go to the electric chair. Oh gosh, we were scared. We went and hid in the basement thinking they were going to surely come after us. They never did. So these were some of the escapades on my weekends. Well, my friend Richie, he lived in a 3-story fourplex apartment. You'd go up a flight of stairs from the basement of the place. You'd go up a flight of stairs and there was 4 doors right there. A duplex on either side. Well, his was the topmost one on the 3rd floor. Now, my father was a house painter, so we were able to get a 5-gallon bucket from my father, and we brought it to his house and we filled it with water in the bathtub, and we stood at the upper window with this 5-gallon bucket of water and waiting for people to walk by on this sidewalk below. And this couple was coming by, a man and his girlfriend, and we dumped this whole 5-gallon bucket of water, totally drenched them. They were screaming and shaking their fist at us, and they ran up the stairs. To get us, but when they got to the top of the stairs, there were 4 doors, 2 on either side of the landing. We were by that time hiding under the bed, you know. They didn't know what door led to what flat, so they're banging on all 4 doors. Nobody was home, and they didn't get an answer from any of the 4 doors, and thank God they didn't break in and kill us. You know, they would have. They were so angry. They were cursing us through the doors, and we were under the bed hiding. So that's the rascals that we were. Another funny story. About 2 blocks from my grandmother's house was a Herbert Sherbert ice cream shop. And my friend Richie and I were at the age where we were daring each other to do exploits, you know. I dare you. You're chicken. You won't do it. I'll do it. You know, so he said, we were at the Herbert Sherbert shop, and we had each bought a double scoop pistachio ice cream on a pointed sugar cone. And he started daring me to stick the ice cream in someone's face. And of course, trying to save face. I can do that. I'm not scared. You chicken, you're chicken. You won't do it. You won't. I said, I'll do it. I'll show you. I'll do it. You're scared. You're yellow. You won't do it. And I was losing face by the minute, and I had to do something, right? And these 2 old ladies were coming out of the Herbert Sherbert shop with their ice creams, and I knew I had to do it. So I made a run for it toward these 2 old ladies, but I got scared at the last moment. And instead of sticking it in their face, I ran up to them. Ran up really aggressively to them. And right when I got in front of them, I stuck the ice cream in my own face like a unicorn. The ice cream's running down and this sugar cone pointing out. These 2 old ladies went, ah! They walked around me, took off at a fast trot down the street, and Richard was rolling in the gutter with laughter. It was better than if I had stuck it in their face, you know. Just stupid stuff that kids do, you know, in San Francisco. Well, we used to go down, to the bay, and we'd fish down there. We had little drop lines, and we'd fish, and Richie knew a couple of black families in the neighborhood that would buy the fish from us, and so that's how we made a little kid money, you know, for ice creams. We'd catch a few flounders and they'd catch a few perch down at the boat docks, and we'd bring them to these 2 black families that always bought them from us. And that gave us money, you know, to buy ice creams and stuff like that, you know. And maybe one last story from those early days. Some of you know the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. It's a beautiful, beautiful Romanesque structure. It's got a massive dome, you know, massive big dome with pillars that hold it up. It's one of the last remaining buildings from the 1936 Pan American Exposition in San Francisco. Well, back in the late 50s, it was pretty much in disrepair. They've done a beautiful restoration of it now, and it's one of the beautiful landmarks of San Francisco. But back in that day, it was broken down. And these massive pillars that held up the dome, there were 5 pillars that held up the big dome. And you could actually, pull the plaster off the pillars and get inside. Well, inside these pillars, they were about 6 feet around. Inside the pillars, they were hollow. And there was a metal ladder that went up all the way to the top of the dome. So we were about, 8, 10, maybe 11 years old. And we had bicycles, we rode our bikes down there, and we climbed up the ladder into the dome. The dome was a double dome. It had a ceiling like this, and then it had the outer dome, which had a greater arc. So between the 2 domes, there was a space of about 50 feet that had a metal cable that hung from one to the other. And we would swing out on this metal cable. We would swing out over this 150-foot drop of beams and 2x4s and this chasm of structure that held that whole dome up. If we ever fell or slipped off that cable and our bodies went down in that massive 2x4s, no one would have ever found us. up in there in those days. And of course, there were hundreds of pigeons that lived up in that dome, and there were pigeon nests everywhere. And we would shoot pigeon eggs. We would raid the nest and with our slingshots. Now they have paintball fights, but we'd have pigeon egg fights with our slingshots. We'd shoot each other with pigeon eggs. That was our recreation up there. But one day we came down and our bicycles were confiscated by the police. I guess they figured we were up there, and there was a note on the pillar: if you want your bicycles, call the San Francisco Police Department. So when we came home without our bicycles, our parents demanded to know the truth, and we ended up confessing, and they went down and got our bikes back from the police department. But we got a terrible butt licking, I'll tell you that, with the wooden coat hanger. Really a bad one. So that was my San Francisco experience. Now back to Sonoma, where I actually lived. I'll make that chapter 2, okay? Yeah, we'll do chapter 2, the Sonoma chapter. But that's the rebel that I was pre-salvation days. Well, I hope you got a laugh out of this. All right. See you later. Bye-bye.